Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to be doing a Q&A of my most frequently asked questions. And so we're going to begin with a question that says, can I use rangefinder lenses on SLRs and vice versa? The answer is no, you can't. The reason for that is that they're completely different designs. A lens for an SLR, of which I've got one here, is designed to focus quite far back because the camera bodies, the distance between the lens mount and the film or the sensor is much longer than in a rangefinder. So you can see with the difference here of the two adapters. So here's a rangefinder lens, the adapter is very small, it's about half an inch or maybe less, and the adapter for the SLR lens is much larger, probably about 3 times the length. So unfortunately they just won't interchange. Can you recommend any wide rangefinder lenses? Well, there are not so many of these around, and when they do come up they tend to be pretty expensive. I believe there are some Russian ones or possibly Ukrainian ones. I'm not entirely sure in which area they were made. I know the Orion is one such, also the Jupiter 12 is another such. The Jupiter 12 is much cheaper than the Orion. It's a 35mm lens, and you have to be careful when mounting it onto certain cameras because it has a rear element that protrudes quite far back into the camera. It can also be tricky to mount on mirrorless for that reason, especially on micro four thirds. I'm sure there are other wide rangefinder lenses. I think there are some by Voigtlander. There are certainly wide lenses from Leica, but as I say, generally they are quite expensive. The Jupiter 12 is one of the cheapest, and that usually goes for about £80 to £90 or thereabouts. So they do exist, but be prepared to pay. The next question, is my radioactive lens harmful? This was a question that I've got a few times actually, and it was usually in response to one of the videos featuring the Pentax 50mm Takumar 1.4, which is very yellow. When you find a lens like that that has gone yellow, it's usually due to radioactivity within the lens glass or the coatings. I'm not entirely sure which, to be honest, but I know it is a product of radioactivity. As for whether the lenses are harmful, all the research I've done suggests that they are not harmful, and I don't have any qualms using them myself. The dosage is fairly small. The particles that are given off are stopped by literally a sheet of paper, as I understand it. I think if you keep a filter on the front of your lens, that's going to block any dangerous particles that it might emit. The body of the lens is going to block the rest, and the camera body that you've mounted the lens on is going to block the remaining portion from the rear. So I don't think for those reasons it's going to be harmful at all. However, don't hold those lenses up to your eye. That would be very unwise. The eye is a very delicate organ and could be damaged if it's in very close proximity to a radioactive lens. How long should I leave a lens in the sunlight to take the yellow out? Well, this is another radioactive lens question. Ultraviolet light does get rid of the yellowing, and you can take one of two routes. You can either leave it in strong sunlight for, I've heard, anything up to 1 or 2 months, or you can buy a UV torch, which are very cheaply available these days, and leave that torch on shining through the lens, and I believe that that's a very much quicker and much more effective way to clear the yellowing than sunlight. However you do it, it is going to take a while. I would set aside at least a month to clear any yellowing out of your lenses. Another question I get asked a lot is, can I use vintage lenses on my Micro Four Thirds camera or my Fuji X series camera or my Sony mirrorless camera as well? Yes, yes and yes are the answers. Any mirrorless camera can mount pretty much any vintage lens. There are one or two that won't fit on certain models. I mentioned the Jupiter 12 earlier, won't mount on Micro Four Thirds. I'm not even sure if it will mount on the Sony A7. The reason for that is the rear element protrudes a lot. But almost all lenses you can mount on any mirrorless camera system. That includes all Micro Four Thirds cameras, all Fuji X series cameras, and all of the Sony A7, A9 series. As I understand it, all vintage lenses are pretty easy to mount to any Canon DSLR, certainly the more recent ones of the past 5 years or so. Nikon users, it's going to be more tricky because of the flange distance and the lens to sensor distance, causing some difficulties. And it's not easy to mount vintage glass on a Nikon camera. I believe there are adapters that will do the job for you, but they usually include another glass element. How successful that is, I don't know, because I've actually never done it. I don't really use Nikon gear. But yeah, any mirrorless camera you can mount pretty much any vintage lens on. Right, the next question is one about crop sensor size and how it affects vintage lenses when you mount them on cameras with a crop sensor. This concept can be a little difficult to get your head around. However, I'll try and make it as easy as possible. All vintage lenses, certainly from the 35mm film days, were of course made for the size of a 35mm frame of film, which, if memory serves me right, is 24 by 36 millimeters. That's the size of image capture device, which in that case was film, that they were made for. Right, so these days we have full frame sensors, but we also have APS-C sensors, which are about roughly 2/3 the size of a full frame sensor, and we also have Micro Four Thirds sensors, which are roughly, in fact pretty much exactly half the size of a full frame sensor. So the first thing to remember is that for any focal length marked on a vintage lens that you mount on a crop sensor body, that effective focal length is going to increase. So, on the Micro Four Thirds sensor, that's half the size of a frame of 35mm film. So that sensor is looking only through the central portion of the lens. It's ignoring everything around the outside that would usually be projected onto the image sensor. Why is it ignoring it? Because it's a small sensor, right? It's only that big as compared to that big. So if we're using a sensor that's that big, it's only going to look through the central portion of the lens. That means it only sees what is visible through the central portion of the lens. And so effectively that's a magnification. Does that make sense? I don't know if a quick drawing would help. Hold on. So here's a little drawing of a fine fellow there. This is why I'm not an artist. And you can see, let's say that this piece of paper, this is the full frame sensor. Okay, so we've got the lens mounted on a full frame sensor and it sees this image. Now then, if we use a crop sensor, that crop sensor is only going to see the central part of the image. So it's going to see, let's say we're using a Micro Four Thirds camera, then the sensor is only going to see this part of the image, the central part of the image, right? So you're actually closer in. You're going to see more of the face. You're not going to see the chin, the hair, anything to the left or the right. And the reason for that is, as I say, we're looking only through the central portion of the lens. So what happens with APS-C? Well, it's the same thing, except it's a little further out. Okay, so the lens is the same, the focal length of the lens is the same, but it's effectively changed. Here's our 35mm frame, here's our APS-C frame. So APS-C is going to see about, what can I say, about a third again as far, right? So your focal length of your lens is going to be increased by about a third or so on APS-C. On Micro Four Thirds, it's going to be increased by 100%. And that's all because those sensors are smaller than the 35mm piece of film that vintage lenses were originally designed for. The only time you get vintage lenses to perform and give the same sort of image, the same focal length that it says on the barrel, is if you use a full frame sensor. This is also why the minimum focus distance of crop sensor cameras, if you're using a vintage lens, the minimum focus effective distance is decreased. So if you're using a rangefinder lens, if you're using a rangefinder lens like this one on a Micro Four Thirds camera, this lens focuses to 3 feet or 1 meter. Well, now on a Micro Four Thirds camera, it's going to focus down to 50 centimeters effectively. You'll still be a meter away from your subject, but because the sensor's looking only through the central bit of the lens, the image is magnified, so the effective minimum focal distance is halved. I hope that makes some sort of sense. The next question is one I've been asked quite a few times, and it is, can I use Kiev /Contax mount lenses on my digital mirrorless camera? Well, in theory you can. There's nothing preventing you from doing it, except they are rather difficult to mount, and here's why. We've got a Kiev camera here, and if I rotate the focus wheel, which is on the top here, you should be able to see that not only is the lens moving, part of the mount is moving too. The focusing helicoid for your lens is actually within the camera body. So the adapters, although they are available, they tend to be quite expensive because they have to have this whole mount plus the focusing helicoid, and the whole thing then turns as it was designed to. The adapters do come up from time to time on eBay, but when they do, they're around £70 to £80 or so, and that's because they actually take a little bit of engineering and a bit of time and a bit of effort to make. So while you can do it, my advice would be don't bother. It's very difficult and it's rather expensive, unless you've got a whole load of Kiev Contax mount lenses that you really, really want to use. Far better, in my opinion, to just stick to the rather more common and more easily adapted Leica thread mount rangefinder lenses. Another question I'm asked fairly often is, what's the best place to buy vintage lenses? Well, I buy them wherever I can find them. I buy some from eBay, some you can find in charity shops, second-hand shops, boot sales, wherever I see an interesting piece of glass. If you're buying from eBay, it's often a good idea to look out for a camera that's advertised with a lens, but the body's not working. You can usually buy those quite cheaply, and you can get a good lens fairly cheaply using that approach. And between you and me, another good way to buy lenses from eBay is if you see a camera for sale with multiple lenses. They are often very much cheaper than if you buy the lenses separately. But that's strictly between you and me, of course. Another question that comes up quite a bit is, does dust or fungus or scratches on the glass of a lens matter? Will it affect image quality? Well, dust. Getting dust into lenses is inevitable. It's going to happen. Vintage lenses, by and large, were not weather sealed. They're open to the air. The tolerances are very fine, but eventually some dust is going to work its way in there over the years, especially if it's a zoom lens, because as you extend the zoom, that's going to draw air in and dust will be drawn in. But all vintage lenses are going to have some dust. Does it matter? In my experience, no, it doesn't. Unless, of course, it's absolutely filled to the brim with dust, but I've never seen one like that. Fungus is a slightly different matter. Again, it's unlikely to directly affect image quality if it's not too far advanced, but don't forget fungus is a living thing and over time it will grow. So the best thing to do with a lens with fungus in it is to take it apart or get it taken apart and get it cleaned, because that's not going to get any better. And if you let the fungus grow, sometimes it can actually erode the coatings and the glass, and then your lens is rather less good than when it left the factory, if not scrap. Scratches on the surface of a lens, and this is going to apply mostly to the front element of a lens and possibly the rear element, they're the exposed elements. They do and they don't matter. One or two minor scratches absolutely will not affect image quality. The only time when scratches do affect image quality are when you've got many, many, many fine scratches on the surface of a lens. That will reduce contrast, it will cause flaring, it will cause ghosting, and it will give you a pretty poor image. You won't be able to focus exactly, and the lens is going to be a mess. When a lens is advertised with some cleaning marks are what else but scratches. Be careful, because if there are a lot of fine scratches, as I say, that's going to seriously impact the image quality. One or two won't. Now, I'm often asked what kind of adapters you should use when adapting vintage glass to a digital mirrorless camera. I only ever use very, very simple so-called dumb adapters, and I'll show you one here. This is an M42 adapter, and this is actually an adapter for M42 to micro four thirds, and literally all it is a tube of metal, a metal tube with an M42 mount on this end and a micro four thirds mount on this end, and that's all I ever use. Very, very simple so-called dumb adapters. Let me show you another one. This is an M39 or an L39 to micro four thirds adapter. Again, it's a metal tube, a very short one in this case, with the right mount on this end, a 39mm mount here, and the micro four thirds mount on this side. There are all sorts of other really smart and very, very clever adapters you can use. Some have a chip built in that will give you a focus light when you're in focus. Some have even an autofocus feature so that you can use these old vintage lenses and get autofocus from them. And they're very cool, but I never find the need for them. I just use the ordinary so-called dumb adapters, and they cost from between £5 to £10. I find that's all I need. They're widely available on eBay, Amazon, and many, many other sellers. And I really think that's all you need for mounting a vintage lens on a digital mirrorless camera. So a lot of people also have asked me what camera I use to do all the sample images in the videos. Well, the camera I use, it's still got this enormous lens on it. The camera I use is this one, the Sony A7. This is a very, very nice camera, and the reason I use it is that it's full frame. It's got a sensor that's the same size as a 35mm piece of film. And using that sensor size, all these lenses, all these old vintage lenses behave. Excuse me. All these old vintage lenses behave in the way that they were designed to do. The focal length stays the same, the minimum focus distance stays the same, and so on. So what you're seeing on the videos is the image from a full frame camera. So there we are. I think that's all the questions I've got for now. I hope that answers a few questions and puts a few matters into perspective. Let me know in the comments box if you like this episode, and also if you've got any other questions you'd like to ask, do feel free to ask them, and I'll try and answer them in another Q&A if that seems to be the right way to go. But that's it from me for now. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to ring the bell and to like and subscribe before you go. I will see you next time for some more Zenography.